think about automation and the diffusion of automation into the operating space, I think we need to begin to think about a very, very complex system engineering problem that is perhaps one of the most complex engineering problems that the automotive industry has faced since its inception. The problem isn't a technology problem. The problem is us. How are we going to fit into this system of advanced sensing, advanced algorithms, and advanced quantum computing? So if we think about evolution for a moment, when we think about our ancestors as humans, we were really never designed to pilot cars at 75 miles an hour on the highway. Our visual central system is tuned for daytime hunting speeds. That means we don't see very well at night. We don't see very well beyond running speed. But some way, we have adapted over the last 100 or more years to do a fairly good job of getting from point A to point B and doing a whole lot of things along the way. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of fatalities along the way, and a lot of learning that happens from novice drivers to experienced drivers. But we're not equipped with the central capabilities to do this. So the machine has a role. It can help us. So begin to think about the vehicle automation space, and whether we're talking about SAE's definitions of automation or NHTSA's, and I put NHTSA's clear levels up there because SAE appears to be changing theirs again. If we think about the automation scope, we can't buy a vehicle today without some level of automation mandated in there, ESC. And increasingly, there are fewer and fewer vehicles on the road without some level of automation. We all can begin to see the vision, and we talk about it, and the news does a wonderful job of parlaying autonomous driving, self-driving, and the vision of level 4 autonomy, where literally I talk to my car and I say, I want to go out for dinner, and it takes me there, and I never touch a wheel. I may not have one in front of me. I have a black box in the pilot scope. But as Bryan Walker-Smith puts it, the reality is the mushy middle, level 1, 2, and 3, where we have some role with the autonomous system. And I say some role because from the view of the driver, the operator, whatever we want to call that future pilot of tomorrow, the differentiation between level 1, 2, and 3 is not so clear. We can define it from an engineering perspective. We're great at creating definitions. But when I get in a vehicle and I don't touch the gas pedal, or I don't have to touch the steering wheel, the operator sees things very differently. And that operator's view of the technology in the vehicle doesn't necessarily map cohesively with that of the design team. So when you put a whole bunch of engineers in the room, they think about how people should work with technology, case and case again, we have a vision, but we have no fundamental infrastructure for imparting that vision on the user population. So anybody familiar with the blinking light VCR problem? VCR should have clock, right? Well, we engineer a clock there, but how many of us still live today thinking about when we were children a few years ago, mid-age, or the like, and begin to think about that clock that we never set? Well, then we came up with automation to fix that. Great. Think about voice systems, an area that I work a lot in the multimodal space. Looking at systems that the computational body of those systems can do a cohesive job of recognizing voice. If the operator has an understanding that I don't need to modulate my voice with the speed of the conversation like I would a human occupant sitting next to me who's also looking at the right light going red or the traffic slamming on the brakes in front of me. So we do a lot of things that are not engineering predictable in nature. So when we begin to think about human factors from an automated vehicle perspective, and I don't mean the self-driving perspective, I mean the increasing encroachment of automation into the vehicle here, there's an enormous amount of questions that we begin to think about and many people begin to ask. The first being smooth transition. Many of us think, oh, okay, we're going to automate the highway, we're going to have super cruise in a few years, in some way I got to tell that operator to take control of that vehicle and handle it. Control back over, take control, drive safely, and do everything I was going to do anyway. Good engineering question. In any sense, it's a trivial question. I think we can actually engineer that to the vehicle. We can deal with that from an engineering perspective. How do we develop interfaces that provide the understanding of the status of the system? We'll come up with some strategies there. Do we need to keep the driver in the loop? Do we ensure that the operator remains attentive at any given point in time? How do we ensure that at some point when I do want to give control back to that vehicle or take control from that vehicle, that I am alert, awake, and engaged and capable of doing that? There's a number of big picture issues when we begin to look at the literature on human-centered automation and we begin to think about other domains where automation is succeeding in that we need to begin to think about. There is no easy answers here. There's some very, very complex answers. And we are about to embark on what I would argue, many-year episode of experimenting with these technologies in real life. Because we can create them, we'll put them out there. We'll try them. We'll see what happens. Hopefully we'll learn from them, and hopefully we'll save many lives along the way. So there's a few issues or topic areas that I'd like to use the next few minutes to talk about. And I'd like everybody to think about these topic areas in relation to their own life and their relation to other forms of automation that they have begun to work with over time. And in some cases, even the garage door opener at the most basic level was a piece of automation created to reduce the complexities of getting in a garage at one point in time. So we can think of even the most basic levels. The first is trust. And I put up the Windows blue screen of death because at the end of the day, I started much of my academic career where I saw way too many of these things. And my trust in Windows hasn't changed from here. Who here in the audience, by show of hands, doesn't hit save frequently on their computer? Once every 5-10 minutes. And you don't hit save at all? Very risky person. So, we trust that Word is going to save for us, and we get burned by that quite often. Even Android, my phone, I'm going to send an email yesterday, and all of a sudden, app XYZ has crashed. So that trust factor in machines, in the auto experience, that trust factor in the dealer relationship, because of the negotiation experience that existed in years past there, doesn't exist. We as humans often lack trust in a situation and fail to observe or achieve the benefit that a technology or situation may give me because of that lack of trust. Let's think about the automation context in the vehicle. That's the older driver who does not use the lane departure collision mitigation systems because they don't trust that the system's going to help them when they need it. And I know everybody's sitting here, well, why wouldn't they? Because I learned to drive in 1935, and I've always done it that way. How many people in the world don't even use rear view mirrors and side mirrors now is amazing. So the time frame to get this stuff into that population, and the population who in essence may need it the most, takes time. The other side that we begin to think about very quickly is overtrust. And all of us in this audience here have a high potential in certain situations to begin to overtrust automation in the vehicle. So even if we think assisted cruise control, one of my colleagues at one of the major OEMs talked to me, we were in a conversation the other day in some field operational work we're doing with ACC in the Boston area right now. And Gam said, every time I get in my car and I begin to work with ACC, I'm overtrusting the situation. And this is a person with about 35 years of human factors experience in the auto industry. You can't find an individual who understands the situation much more. So that means the general consumer, when you begin to put ACC in front of them, which people aren't using in the US to the degree we'd like to believe, in Europe they are a little more, or lane keeping assist, they're going to rely on that automation at a level that it is not engineered and equipped to. We're also going to see folks in great commercials day in, day out. We watch on our YouTube videos of people playing around with automated technology in the vehicle, crashing because they're over-trusting that technology, they're misusing that technology. And we're going to continue to see case studies here because our belief is the technology will help us in ways that the designer and the engineer never viewed that. So trust is learned over time. But the question becomes, how do we ensure that the human, the operator, invests the time to learn to trust the system appropriately? In the US marketplace, we have a tendency to go to the auto dealer, negotiate for a car, feel like we paid too much, and want to get out of that dealer as quickly as possible. Not the start of a trusting relationship with a piece of extremely complex technology. Trust may not be acquired based upon intuition alone. We have no mental model to acquire the trust that we need. How do we create an ecosystem to build trust? Trust is incredibly easily eroded by failure. As mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work in voice systems in the vehicle. Voice systems actually are quite effective interface when they work. How many people in the audience have had the voice system on their Apple phone, their Google phone, or their vehicle misrepresent what they wanted to say? How much trust does that give you in the faith of the technology when you're sending your loved one a message, "Hi, I'm going to be late for dinner," and all of a sudden they're worried about some other gobbledygook message that autocorrect is doing for us? But this is the mental model and automation that's being built in and day out, and I'm going to give my life to it. So, the future also may be one of more relatively novice drivers. So, as we vacuum out vehicles miles driven from the number of vehicles miles traveled, the assumption that all of the automotive engineering community today is making is that the operator, when they need to drive again, will have the capacity and the capability to drive. We are experiential learners in nature. As we vacuum VMD out of the vehicle fleet, and that's not travel, that's driven, we will no longer be the same individuals to respond to situations when we need to. What does that mean? We are going to start creating a population of novice drivers. You don't have to look far. Who here is getting on an airplane to leave Detroit? I'm guessing at least a third of the audience. Anybody here remember about 2 years ago, the FAA sent out a flight safety briefing to encourage pilots to maintain manual flight control more frequently to reduce skill erosion at the expense of automation. That is where you have a baseball bat to motivate training and compliance and a skilled user force. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of skill erosion is not something we can deal with in some fashion, but we do need to think about it. And we cannot move forward with a flawed assumption that when I ask Joe to take control from the computer, the robot, the machine, that Joe will be the same driver that Joe is today. And that Joe's son, who never really learned to drive a vehicle manually, will have that skill set. Education. One of the myths about the impact of automation on human performance is that as the investment in automation increases, less investments in human expertise are required. It's a myth. The more we automate, the more we have to understand the characteristics of that automation, the bounds of that automation, when I can use it, when I can't use it. The great picture of Google's headquarters in Massachusetts on a great snowy day over our wonderful snowy winter in Boston that I've used a couple times in presentations as a nice case study of how do you know when to turn this stuff off? Is it all going to be sense force? Or are the 2-foot potholes that litter the streets of America going to determine that for us? Failures in automation. There will always be a set of circumstances beyond engineering control. And Raj Parmesan, who unfortunately just passed away a few months ago, was probably one of the 2 individuals in the country who really understands the depth and complexity of the automation and human-centered issue in America. Remember, I said 2 and one's now recently deceased. As the level of trust in the system and reliability of the system improves, nears 100, our capacity to respond and recover from errors decreases. You've got to think about that from an engineering perspective. Really nice IEEE Spectrum article, and this is 2009 reading. It's not on automotives. Well worth the 5-minute read. It's an executive read. Really worth great case studies to think about. Not answers, case studies to think about, because there are no simple answers. So, workload and performance. There's a fundamental relationship between the amount of workload that an individual is operating under and their performance. We need enough demand to stay alert and awake, but not too much that I'm distracted and overloaded. So if I show up in my office at any given day and my desk is filled with papers, many of us say, where do I start? Or my email box looks like mine does half the time. What place do I start? I don't perform well. I spend too much time thinking about where to start. Similarly, if there's nothing there, I don't perform well. A number of years ago, I drew these beautiful colors around the Hertzsprung-Dodson curve, which is not a real parabola in the real world, but at least can be represented well on paper to begin to think about the optimal operating range. Now, from a policy perspective, from an automotive perspective, we've been very focused on the distraction debate for a number of years. The worry about too much workload, too much stress, too much arousal, reducing performance. Many of you in the audience, I'm sure, have some involvement in the distracted driving debate within each organization. And I say debate because what is distraction is a very, very difficult concept to define. What does automation do? Drives things back the other way. So we have two forces pulling against each other very hard. And what do we create? We create an error where we need some level of assistance in the human-centered nature to help the operator fight these two forces. The force being, I rely on the automation, I fall asleep, I become inattentive. Or I pick up my phone, I text, and I engage. So we may really need to think appropriately around a functional view of driver attention that focuses on holistically, system-wide, vehicle, infrastructure, automation, environment, all the automation levels, and how that cohesively fits together and begins to impact safety. One of the efforts that I'm fortunate to lead, the head consortia out of MIT, we're very much focused on how do we begin to measure the workload aspects that are being imparted on operators from multimodal systems in the vehicle. Because if we can't measure it, how the heck am I supposed to begin to manage it and optimize to it? So, let's talk about aviation for a second. In the 80s, the view of automation was the pilot was the source of errors. The pilot is the cause of accidents. Depending on the statistic you want, 90% of the accidents on the road are driver error. The human's the unreliable component, and we can improve safety by reducing the human's involvement. This sound anything familiar to the vehicle environment today here? It sounds awful familiar. So what happened to about 20 years in the aviation domain? And the aviation domain is not a perfect model for the vehicle domain, but it is one that has more literature and more study in the automation area than anywhere else. What happened in the aviation domain is a shift in view over the last 10 to 15 years. Human error is the indicator of the deeper issues. The human in the loop is imperative to take control where the machine cannot. And we can improve safety by leveraging what the machine is good at, what the automation does effectively, and what the human can add to that. We have flexible computing power between our ears that we cannot produce and code at this point. So we can be thinking about how do we leverage our expertise in combination with the automation. And if we think about case study after case study of automation failures and automation successes in aviation, you can think of many cases where the automation failed, the pilot was over-trusting, over-reliant, crash occurred. Other cases, such as the miracle in the Hudson, where the pilot had the skill to say, well, how am I going to deal with this situation? And no automated system that we can create can handle that. So when we begin to think about this, is the automated system backing up the pilot, or is the pilot backing up the automated system? And who do we see in court, and who do we hold liable? The pilot. So, finally, how do we begin to understand how we're behaving in these systems? We don't do it in a lab. We do need to look at how people are behaving in real life. And an effort that I'm launching at MIT is really aimed at trying to develop the amount of naturalistic and field operational data we have on how people are behaving with advanced technologies in the vehicle. And I say advanced technologies because it goes everywhere from the level 2 systems right on down to the infotainment side. None of the auto industry, none as we begin to talk, really has the cohesive data to make holistic decisions on how people are behaving with the technologies on the roads today. And I say don't because it is expensive data, difficult data to mine. So we're trying to bring a broad section of the industry together to begin to understand how do people use technology? How do we train them? How do we leverage the benefits that we all see from an engineering perspective? Making data-driven design a reality. Thank you very much.